Chapter 4 of The Seventh Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Robert Kuiper. The Seventh Man by Max Brand. Chapter 4. King Hall. There's a very general and very erroneous impression that alcohol builds the mood of a man. As a matter of fact, it merely makes his temper of the moment fast. The man who takes his first drink with a smile ends in uproarious laughter, and he who frowns will often end in fighting. Vic Gregg did not frown as he drank, but the corners of his lips turned up a trifle in a smile of fixed and acid pleasantry, and his glance went from face to face in the barroom steadily, with a trifling pause at each pair of eyes. Beginning with himself, he hated mankind in general. The burn of the cheap whiskey within served to set the color of that hatred in a fixed dye. He did not lift his chaser, but his hand closed around it hard. If someone had given him an excuse for a fist fight or an outburst of cursing, it would have washed his mind as clean as a new slate, and 5 minutes later he might have been with Betty Neal, riotously happy. Instead, everyone overflowed with good nature, gossip, questions about his work, and the danger in him crystallized. He registered cold reasons for his disgust. Beginning in the first person, he loathed himself as a thick-headed ass for talking to Betty as he had done. As well put a burr under one's saddle and then feel surprised because the horse bucks. He passed on to the others with equal precision. Captain Lorrimer was as dirty as a greaser, and like a greaser, loose-lipped, unshaven. Chick Stewart was a born fool, and a fool by self-culture, as his never-changing grin amply proved. Lew Perkins sat in the corner on a shaky old apple barrel and brushed back his long mustaches to spit at the cuspidor, and miss it. If this were Vic Gregg's saloon, he would teach the old loafers more accuracy or break his neck. "How are you, Gregg?" murmured someone behind him. He turned and found Sheriff Pete Glass with his right hand already spread on the bar while he ordered a drink for two. That was one of the sheriff's idiosyncrasies. He never shook hands if he could avoid it, and Gregg hated him senselessly, bitterly for it. No doubt everyone in the room noticed, and they would tell afterwards how the sheriff had avoided shaking hands with Vic Gregg. Cheap play for notoriety, thought Gregg. Glass was pushing the bottle towards him. "Help yourself," said Gregg. "This is on me, Vic." "I most generally like to buy the first drink." Pete Glass turned his head slowly, for indeed all his motions were leisurely, and one could not help wondering at the stories of his exploits, the tales of his hair-trigger alertness. Perhaps these half-legendary deeds sent the thrill of uneasiness through Vic Gregg. Perhaps it was owing to the singular hazel eyes with little splotches of red in them, very mild eyes, but one could imagine anything about them. Otherwise there was nothing exceptional in Glass, for he stood well under middle height, a starved figure with a sinewy crooked neck, as if bent on looking up to taller men. His hair was sandy, his face tawny brown, his shirt a gray blue, and everyone knew his dusty roan horse. By nature, by temperament, and by personal selection, he was suited to blend into a landscape of sage-dotted plains or sand. Tireless as a lobo on the trail, swift as a bobcat in fight, hunted men had been known to ride in and give themselves up when they heard that Pete Glass was after them. "Any way you want, partner," he was saying in his soft, rather husky voice. He poured his drink, barely enough to cover the bottom of his glass, for that was another of Pete's ways. He could never afford to weaken his hand or deaden his eye with alcohol, and even now he stood sideways at the bar, facing Gregg and also facing the others in the room. But the larger man, with sudden scorn for this caution, brimmed his own glass and poised it swiftly. "Here's how!" and down it went. Ordinary red-eye heated his blood and made his brain dizzy. It loosened his tongue and numbed his lips, but today it left him cool, confident, and sharpened his vision till he felt that he could see through the mind of everyone in the room. Captain Lorimer, for instance, was telling a jocular story to Chick Stewart in the hope that Chick would set them up for everyone, and old Lew Perkins was waiting for the treat. And perhaps the sheriff was wondering how he could handle Vic in case of need, or how long it would take to run him down. Not long, decided Gregg, breathing hard. No man in the world could put him on the run. Glass was treating in turn, and again the brimming drink went down Vic's throat and left his brain clear. Wonderfully clear. He saw through Betty Neal now. She had purposely played off Blondy against him to make them both jealous. "Won't you join us, Dad?" the sheriff was saying to Lew Perkins, and Vic Gregg smiled. He understood. The sheriff wanted an excuse to order another round of drinks because he had it in mind to intoxicate Gregg. Perhaps Gregg had something on him. Perhaps the manhunter thought that Gregg had had a part in that Wilsonville affair 2 years back. That was it. And he wanted to make Vic talk when he was drunk. "Don't mind if I do," Lew said, slapping both hands on the bar as if he owned it, and while he waited for his drink. "What are they going to do with Swain?" The doddering idiot. Swain was the last man Glass had taken, and Lew Perkins should have known that the sheriff never talked about his work. The old ass was in his green age, his second childhood. "Swain turned state evidence," said Pete curtly. "He'll go free, I suppose. Fill up your glass, partner. Can see you're thirsty yet." This was to Gregg, who had purposely poured out a drink of the sheriff's own chosen dimension to see if the latter would notice. This remark fixed his suspicions. It was certain that the manhunter was after him. But again, in scorn, he accepted the challenge and poured a stiff dram. "That's right," nodded the sheriff. "You got nothing on your shoulders. You can let yourself go, Vic. Sometimes," he sighed, "I wish I could do the same." The sneaky coyote, thought Gregg. He's luring me on. "Turn state evidence," maundered Lew Perkins. "Well, they's a lot of 'em lose their guts when they're caught. I remember way back in time when Bannock was running full blast." Why did not someone shut off the old idiot before he was thoroughly started? He might keep on talking like the crank of a windmill in a steady breeze endlessly, for Lew was old, 75, 80, 85. He himself probably did not know just how old, and he had lived through at least 2 generations of pioneers with a myriad stories about them. He could string out tales of the Long Trail, Abilene, Wichita, Ellsworth, Great Bend, Newton, where 11 men were murdered in one night. He knew the vigilante days in San Francisco and early times in Alder Gulch. "Nobody would have thought Plummer was yaller, but he turned out that way," droned on the narrator. "Grit! He had enough to fit out 20 men. When Crawford shot him and busted his right arm, he went right on and learned to shoot with his left and started hurting Jack again. Packed that lead with him till he died, and then they found Jack's bullet in his wrist, all worked smooth by the play of the bones. Afterwards it turned out that Plummer ran a whole gang, but before we learned that we'd been fooled enough to make him sheriff. We got to Plummer right after he'd finished hanging a man and took him to his own gallows. You'd have thought a cool devil like that would have made a good end, but he didn't. He just got down on his knees and cried and asked God to help him. Then he begged us to give him time to pray, but one of the boys up and told him he could do his praying from the crossbeam. And that was Henry Plummer that killed 100 men, him and his gang." Murmured the sheriff, and looked uneasily about. Now that his eyes were turned away, Vic could study him at leisure, and he wondered at the smallness of the man. Suppose one were able to lay hands on him, it would be easy to. "See you later, boys," drawled Glass, and sauntered from the room. Lew Perkins sighed as the most important part of his audience disappeared, but having started talking, the impetus carried him along.